The day did not begin with the sun. Before any golden ray touched the mist-covered valleys of feudal Japan, the world of the shinobi was already awake. Dawn emerged timidly, filtered through a dense fog that crept among centuries-old pine trees, enveloping narrow paths, wooden houses darkened by time, and mountains that seemed to silently watch every human movement. The early morning air was cold and damp. There was the smell of wet earth, of moss clinging to stones, of freshly cut bamboo. The dominant sound was not bird song, still asleep, but the soft rustling of leaves, the dripping of water running off thatched roofs, and occasionally the dry crack of a branch breaking beneath light, calculated steps. No one walked distracted. In a small village hidden among hills, similar to those that existed in the regions of Iga and Koga, the houses were arranged functionally, not aesthetically. Nothing there was made to impress. Everything served a purpose: to survive, to observe, to endure. Wooden doors slid open silently. Figures emerged wrapped in simple clothing, shades of brown, gray, and dark blue, colors that blended into the landscape. There were no elegant uniforms nor visible symbols of power. Anonymity was the first armor. Children, adolescents, and adults moved with equal seriousness. Some carried buckets of water drawn from nearby streams, others adjusted worn straw sandals. A boy, no more than 8, knelt to carefully tie a cloth around his ankle. His face showed no sleepiness, it showed focus. Shinobi training did not begin in a formal dojo, surrounded by rigid ceremonies. It began there, in silence, in repetition, in observing the environment from the very first opening of the eyes. As the sky slowly brightened, shades of gray gave way to a pale blue. The sun was still hidden behind the mountains, but its presence was announced by the slight warming of the air. A new day emerged, and with it, another opportunity to survive in a world fractured by wars, broken alliances, and constant betrayals. To be shinobi was not a title. It was a condition of existence.
When one speaks of a ninja, the image that almost automatically arises in the modern mind is that of a figure dressed entirely in black, face covered, leaping across rooftops under the moonlight, wielding gleaming shurikens and vanishing in clouds of smoke. This image is powerful, cinematic, seductive, and, to a large extent, false. The ninja, or more precisely, the shinobi, did not live for spectacle. He was not a mystical warrior isolated from the world, nor a supernatural assassin trained solely to kill in silence. These representations are largely the product of kabuki theater, popular literature from the Edo period, and centuries later, Western cinema and pop culture. In historical reality, the shinobi was above all a specialist in adaptation. He did not always dress in black. Indeed, absolute black was rare in nature and easily noticeable at night. They preferred earthy tones, dark blues, grays, muted greens. They dressed as peasants, monks, merchants, or ordinary travelers. The best camouflage was to appear irrelevant. Another recurring myth is that ninjas and samurai were natural enemies. The truth is more complex. Many shinobi served samurai clans, acting as agents of espionage, sabotage, reconnaissance, and psychological warfare. In some cases, samurai themselves received training in shinobi techniques. And perhaps the greatest misconception of all, the ninja did not live solely by violence. Killing was an extreme possibility, not the primary objective. A good shinobi was one who completed his mission without being seen, without fighting, and ideally without leaving traces. If fighting became necessary, something had already gone wrong. The true training routine, therefore, was not composed only of exotic martial arts, but of long, silent, and seemingly mundane practices. Walking without leaving footprints, memorizing landscapes, controlling breathing, enduring hunger, cold, pain, and fear. The ninja did not seek glory. He sought effectiveness.
To understand the true training of a shinobi, it is necessary to understand the world in which he emerged. We are in feudal Japan, particularly between the 14th and 16th centuries, during one of the most unstable periods in Japanese history, the Sengoku period, literally, the period of the warring states. It was an era marked by constant wars between rival clans. Central authority was weak, and the feudal lords, the daimyo, competed for territory, resources, and influence. Castles were built and destroyed. Alliances were formed and betrayed with equal speed. In this landscape of chaos, information was worth as much as swords. This is where the mountainous regions of Iga and Koga, in what are now Mie and Shiga prefectures, come into play. Unlike other areas dominated by powerful clans, these regions were geographically isolated and difficult to access, with narrow valleys and winding trails. This favored the development of semi-autonomous communities, less tightly controlled by feudal lords. There, entire families developed, over generations, practical knowledge of survival, espionage, and irregular warfare. The shinobi did not emerge from a formal school, but from a collective way of life. The villages functioned almost like confederations. Decisions were made collectively. Knowledge was shared, but carefully protected from outsiders. Techniques were not openly written down. Many were transmitted orally, encoded, or disguised within teachings that appeared simple on the surface. Training began early. Children were exposed from a young age to observing nature, controlling the body, and understanding the environment. There was no clear line between training and living. Life itself was the training. The shinobi was not a warrior separate from society. He was its direct product. While samurai followed rigid codes of honor and hierarchy, shinobi operated in the gaps of the system. They existed where the law did not reach, where morality was shaped by necessity, and where survival demanded intelligence above brute strength. The sun finally breaks over the mountain peaks. The mist begins to dissipate, revealing trails, cultivated fields, and bodies in constant motion. The day advances, and with it, the invisible routine of a shinobi intensifies. But this is only the beginning.
The sun was not yet high when the physical training began in earnest. The morning light passed through the treetops and cast long shadows on the uneven ground. There were no shouts of command, drums, or showy rituals. The beginning was silent, almost ritualistic in its simplicity. The body needed to be awake before the mind took risks. The shinobi gathered in small groups or often trained alone. Autonomy was a fundamental part of the learning process. Each individual knew their limitations and responsibilities. There was no constant figure of a master watching everything. Nature fulfilled that role. Silent running and endurance. The first activity of the day was continuous movement, light but long runs along the mountain trails. It was not about speed, but about endurance and breath control. Feet touched the ground consciously, avoiding loose stones, dry branches, or leaves that might betray their passage. Running noiselessly was a skill trained daily. The trails were chosen deliberately, steep, slippery terrain with exposed roots. Each obstacle taught balance, reading the environment, and immediate adaptation. The body learned to respond without hesitation. Breathing was deep and rhythmic. Inhale through the nose, exhale slowly through the mouth. There was no room for shortness of breath or loss of control. A shinobi panting was a shinobi vulnerable. Following the warm-up came training in falling and rolling, practices essential for infiltration, escape, and maneuvering through hostile terrain. They deliberately threw themselves onto slopes, rolled among rocks, and learned to absorb impacts with their entire bodies. Shoulders, back, hips, everything was utilized to dissipate the force of the fall. The objective was not to avoid falling, but to know how to fall without injury. Each movement was repeated dozens of times. Pain was part of the learning process, but it was not celebrated. The focus was on efficiency: fall, rise, continue. In real combat, there would be no time for self-pity.
Unlike modern training focused on physical appearance, the shinobi's strength was functional. They carried logs, lifted stones, and climbed trees, makeshift walls, and rock faces. The weight was not constant. Each day offered a different challenge. Climbing a tree with broken branches required grip strength. Scaling a rammed earth wall demanded reading the footholds. The body became adaptable, capable of reacting to unpredictable situations. The training did not isolate muscles. It integrated the whole body. With the sun higher, the focus of the training shifted. The body was already warm, awake, and responsive. Now it was time for the skills that separated a simple survivor from a true shinobi. One of the most repeated practices was silent walking. The shinobi practiced the so-called shinobi aruki, a specific way of walking, distributing weight gradually, starting from the outer edge of the foot and slowly transferring it to the center. They walked over gravel, dry leaves, sand, mud, and even wooden roofs. The challenge was to cross the terrain without producing perceptible sound. Sometimes a bell was hung near the path. If it rang, the training started over. Camouflage was also part of daily learning. It was not just about hiding behind trees, but about blending in with the environment. They learned to observe how light struck, where shadows formed, and how the wind moved the vegetation. A good hiding spot did not attract attention. The shinobi were trained to observe everything. During apparently simple walks, they were instructed to memorize details: number of steps between 2 points, position of specific stones, natural and artificial sounds, changes in the terrain. Afterwards, they were tested. Someone would ask, how many houses were there after the bend of the stream? Or which tree had its trunk split in half? To err meant repeating the route. In the afternoon, the use of tools was also practiced, many of which would be erroneously called ninja weapons centuries later. Ropes, hooks, small blades, nails, pepper powders or ash, simple blowguns. Nothing was exotic. Everything was portable, improvisable, and easy to conceal. The training involved assembling, disassembling, and hiding these objects quickly. A shinobi needed to know how to abandon tools without attachment if it was necessary to escape. Survival came before equipment. A significant part of the afternoon was dedicated to common tasks: farming, house maintenance, gathering firewood,
preparing food. This was not a break, it was training in disguise. Weeding a field developed endurance. Chopping wood trained precision and strength. Working in silence reinforced discipline. Every daily activity was integrated into physical and mental training. For the shinobi, there was no clear separation between life and preparation. When the sun began to descend, lengthening the shadows once again, the body was already tired, but the mind remained alert. The day was not yet over. In fact, for a shinobi, the night was when everything became more serious.
The day ends as it began, in silence. The mountains swallow the village once more. The mist slowly returns to the valleys, and the wooden houses seem to dissolve into the landscape. There are no obvious signs of the grueling routine that unfolded there. No monument, no flag, no symbol of glory. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy of the shinobi, to exist without leaving traces. For centuries, they were deliberately erased from official history, not because they did not exist, but because their success depended precisely on not being remembered. A successful shinobi was one whose name would never be written. Still, their presence echoes. It echoes in the way we understand strategy, intelligence, and unconventional warfare. It echoes in valuing observation over brute force. It echoes in the idea that survival is, often, more important than winning. When revisiting the daily routine of a shinobi, from the silent dawn to the exhausting night training, it becomes clear that ninjutsu was never just a set of secret techniques. It was a practical philosophy of adaptation to the world. The training did not seek to create invincible warriors, but individuals capable of learning quickly, acting with discretion, enduring adversity, and making decisions under extreme pressure. Each morning run was not just physical exercise, but a reminder that the body needed to serve the mind. Each silent walk trained more than just the feet, it trained patience. Each night spent motionless in the darkness taught that not every action requires movement. The shinobi learned early on that control is more powerful than force, and that information is worth more than confrontation.
Centuries have passed since the Sengoku period. Japan has changed. The world has changed. But the fundamental principles of shinobi training remain surprisingly relevant. Today, we live in a different yet equally unstable environment. Information overload, rapid changes, constant competition, continuous surveillance. In this context, shinobi skills such as critical observation, adaptation, emotional control, and strategic thinking are more relevant than ever. The shinobi teaches us that not every battle needs to be fought, not every victory needs to be visible, and not every strength needs to be displayed. Sometimes surviving is already a form of resistance. When removing the ninja from the exaggerated myth and placing him back into real history, something curious happens. He becomes even more impressive. Not for throwing shurikens in slow motion, but for waking up before dawn to train in silence. Not for disappearing in smoke, but for walking miles without being noticed. Not for being invincible, but for knowing when to retreat. The true shinobi was not a fantastical character. He was a human being highly trained to understand the world as it really is. And perhaps that is why, even after so many centuries, we remain fascinated. When night covers the mountains again, and the village disappears into the darkness, the sensation remains that something stays there, not visible, not palpable, but present. The legacy of the shinobi is not in the weapons, the clothes, or the exaggerated myths. It lies in the idea that intelligence, creativity, and adaptability can be more powerful than any sword. They lived in the shadows not out of cowardice, but out of wisdom. And perhaps by observing the world with a little more attention, silence, and strategy, we may realize that these shadows still have much to teach us.